It was 3 o'clock hours on June 6, 1944. Over the English Channel, a fleet of 5,000 vessels advanced in the darkness toward the coast of Normandy. Aboard the landing crafts, 130,000 soldiers vomited over the side, prayed in silence, or stared at the horizon with wide eyes.
It is the largest military operation ever undertaken in history. It involves so many people, so many layers of military apparatus, from transports and tanks, ammunition, soldiers and sailors, communication devices, aircraft, tremendous amount of coordination.
What happened that day changed the history of the 20th century. But 80 years later, among the declassified documents, questions persist that still do not have a definitive answer. This is the account of the most shocking mysteries of D-Day. General George S. Patton Jr. had been out of combat for months, temporarily relieved of duty after slapping a hospitalized soldier in Sicily. The general most feared by the German High Command remained in southeast England at the head of an army group composed for the most part of inflatable vehicles, wooden airplanes, and radio antennas broadcasting into the void. Operation Fortitude was the largest deception campaign in the history of warfare, and it worked in a way that the Allied planners themselves scarcely expected. The plan had two branches. Fortitude North projected toward Scandinavia the threat of a non-existent Fourth British Army, with fictitious headquarters in Edinburgh, Stirling and Dundee to keep German divisions pinned down in Norway. Fortitude South was the higher stake, to convince the German General Staff that any landing in Normandy would be a diversionary maneuver and that the main blow would fall weeks later at the Pas de Calais. The non-existent army that would lead that phantom attack was called the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, and it had its virtual headquarters in southeast England with 11 paper divisions, 250 inflatable landing crafts, fictitious vehicles, and a radio communications network that emitted constant traffic into the void. Patton was the perfect decoy. The Germans feared him more than any other Allied general, and it was logical to assume that he would command the decisive attack. But the centerpiece of the entire deception was not a general or an army. It was a single man in a room surrounded by papers. Juan Pujol Garcia, a poultry salesman from Catalonia born in 1912, had tried twice before the war to offer his services to British espionage. Both times he was rejected. Then he approached German intelligence, invented credentials, and convinced the Abwehr, the Reich's counterintelligence service, that he was a trusted agent settled in Great Britain. He was never in Great Britain when he began working for the Germans. He drafted his reports in Lisbon by consulting tourist guides, road maps, and British Admiralty publications purchased in bookstores. When the British discovered that someone was sending false but plausible information to the Germans from supposedly London, they actively sought him out. In 1942, MI5 located him, recruited him, and assigned him the codename Garbo. He was, in intelligence jargon, a double agent. With his MI5 handler, Thomas Harris, Pujol built a network of 27 alleged sub-agents, all completely invented. Some had names, life stories, romantic problems, even illnesses. One of them died in the course of the operation, and the Germans even sent a note of condolence. In the months leading up to June 6, 1944, Garbo sent more than 500 radio messages to the German intelligence post in Madrid, meticulously prepared in London, each contributing to building the picture that the main Allied attack was heading to the Pas de Calais. The Bletchley Park Decryption Center, which intercepted and decrypted German communications encrypted with the Enigma machine, allowed verification in real time whether the Germans were believing the deception, and they were believing it. On June 2, 1944, 4 days before the landing, Bletchley was able to report the German General Staff estimated that Allied preparations were already complete and expected an initial landing in Normandy or Brittany, followed by the main attack in the Pas de Calais. Exactly what Fortitude intended for them to believe. But the most disconcerting piece of the deception did not occur before D-Day, it occurred after. On the afternoon of June 6, 1944, when the Allies had already been fighting on the beaches of Normandy for hours, Garbo sent an urgent message to his German handlers. The text, prepared with the usual care of MI5, insisted that the Normandy landing was exactly what it appeared to be, the diversion. The real attack, still pending, aimed at the Pas de Calais. The message arrived late after the hour when the Germans would have needed it. This delay was deliberate on the part of the British, but it had a paradoxical effect. The Germans, irritated by receiving the warning late, reviewed Garbo's credentials and concluded that the agent had acted with such zeal that he had taken excessive risks. His credibility, if anything, increased. The result was extraordinary. Even with the Allies already established in Normandy, the German 15th Army Group, with 15 divisions entrenched in the Pas de Calais, remained motionless for weeks, waiting for a second landing that never arrived. An entire army, immobilized by a Catalan chicken salesman and his non-existent agents. The mystery that remains is not whether fortitude worked. It worked. The mystery is how it was possible that the general staff of a military power as sophisticated as Nazi Germany believed for weeks, even with the beaches of Normandy full of Allied soldiers, that this was not the main attack. The answer has to do with confirmation biases, with the fact that the Germans already had the mental image of where the decisive blow would come from, and that fortitude confined itself to reinforcing what the German general staff already wanted to believe. Juan Pujol Garcia received the German Iron Cross and days later the Order of the British Empire. It is the only known case in the history of the Second World War where the same man received decorations from both sides. At 6:30 in the morning on June 6, 1944, the telephone rang in a stone house in Herrlingen, a quiet village on the outskirts of Ulm in southern Germany. On the other end of the line was General Lieutenant Hans Speidel, Chief of Staff of Army Group B, calling from the Château de la Roche-Guyon on the banks of the Seine, about 250 kilometers north of Paris. The man who picked up the telephone was General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, the German commander whose energy and presence should have been at that moment in Normandy, where the largest amphibious landing in history had just begun. Rommel was not in Normandy because he had gone to celebrate the birthday of his wife, Lucy Maria. The sequence of decisions that led the most capable officer of the German Western Front to be 12 hours away from his headquarters at the exact moment of the landing is, in retrospect, one of the most costly accumulations of errors in 20th century military history. And yet, seen in its context, each individual decision seemed reasonable. German meteorologists had reported that conditions in the English Channel would not be suitable for an amphibious landing before June 10th. Unlike the Allies, the Germans lacked meteorological stations in the Western Atlantic, which made their forecasts structurally inferior. Based on that information, Rommel decided it was the moment to take advantage of the window and make the trip he had planned. According to the testimony of his naval advisor, Conter-Admiral Friedrich Ruger, which he recorded in his memoirs, Rommel not only wanted to be with Lucy for her birthday, he also planned to continue his journey to the Obersalzberg to meet with Hitler and personally ask him for 2 additional panzer divisions to reinforce the defenses of Normandy. He left Herrlingen on the 5th. On the 6th at 6:30 he already knew what was happening. He immediately cancelled his planned visit to Hitler, gave instructions over the telephone, and got into his open-top Porsche automobile. The return journey at full speed along French roads took almost 12 hours. He arrived at La Roche-Guyon at dusk on June 6th, when the beaches were already consolidated. And here is the rift that historians have not been able to close completely. Would his presence have changed anything? Anthony Beevor points out that Rommel would have been able to galvanize the local formations, imposing rapid decisions that compensated for the paralysis of command. Max Hastings goes further. Rommel's physical energy, his ability to be personally at the front and force action, could have produced a more coordinated reaction in the first critical hours. The Germans in Normandy that morning were literally without direction. The commander of the 21st Panzer Division, General Major Edgar Feuchtinger, was not at his headquarters. It was widely believed among his own men that he was with a female friend in Paris. The commander of the 7th Army, General Oberst Friedrich Dollmann, had called a command exercise for division generals in Rennes that very day. Rommel's own chief of staff, Speidel, who should have been coordinating the defense, had taken advantage of his superior's absence to invite his fellow anti-Hitler conspirators to dine at the chateau. When the news of the landing began, the headquarters of Army Group B was literally in the middle of a social gathering. But the deepest question persists. Even if Rommel had been there, could he have ordered the movement of the reserve panzer divisions? That decision was not his. It belonged to Hitler. At 6 o'clock in the morning on June 6, 1944, General der Infanterie Günther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff of OB West, the German High Command in Western Europe, called the OKW headquarters at the Berghof, Hitler's residence in the Bavarian Alps. The request was urgent. They needed authorization to deploy the OKW Panzer Reserves, especially the 1st SS Panzer Corps, quartered on the outskirts of Paris. The German High Command in the West believed that a major landing was taking place and wanted to move the armor immediately to launch a counterattack before the Allies established themselves. The response that came back from the Berghof was laconic. The request was denied. Adolf Hitler was asleep. He had been awake until 3 o'clock hours, conversing with Eva Braun and Joseph Goebbels about cinema and about the situation in the world. The news of the Allied paratrooper drops had not yet reached Berchtesgaden when he finally went to sleep. His aides, who had strict instructions not to wake him with incomplete information, decided not to interrupt his sleep. The denial had a devastating effect on the German response. The OKW Panzer divisions, which included the fierce 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend and the Panzerlehr, the best according to the testimony of Albert Speer in his memoirs, he arrived at the Berghof around 10 o'clock in the morning and found that Hitler had still not been awakened because the OKW considered the landing a diversionary attack. Hitler's personal aide, Hauptsturmführer Otto Günscher, offered a different version, claiming to have entered the Great Hall of the Berghof at 8 o'clock hours and found Hitler conversing with General Feldmarschall Keitel and General Jodl. According to Günscher, Hitler had said, "Gentlemen, this is the invasion. I have always said it would come here." But as Beevor points out, this version from Hitler himself has an internal problem. If he really believed that Normandy was the main point of attack, there is no logical explanation for his continuing to deny the deployment authorization of the panzer divisions until 1500 hours. The delay only makes sense if Hitler, like the bulk of the German High Command, continued to believe that Normandy was the diversion and the Pas-de-Calais the true objective. Meanwhile, the divisions that were available, like the 21st Panzer of the negligent Feuchtinger, wandered through the Caen region without clear orders for hours. Brigadier Bill Williams, head of intelligence for Montgomery's 21st Army Group, had described the central question of the campaign. All the time, we wondered to what extent these men would perform well in spite of Hitler. The Führer's behavior in the first hours of June 6th answered that question with brutal clarity. Max Hastings is direct in his assessment. The argument that the early deployment of the Panzer Reserves would have been destroyed by Allied aviation is, in his words, patently false, given that other formations like the 21st Panzer itself managed to move to the battlefield with difficulties but without being annihilated. Allied aviation operated that morning with serious deficiencies in ground air control and naval artillery coordination. A massive and early panzer counterattack would have been, in the best case for the Allies, an extremely dangerous situation. The 12th SS Panzer Hitlerjugend, composed mostly of fanatical young men from the SS who had shown themselves fiercely effective in combat, departed from Lisieux, 65 kilometers from Caen, only late in the afternoon of June 6th. Its vanguard elements crossed the Odon River south of Caen that night. If it had received the order 6 or 7 hours earlier, its arrival at the battlefield would have coincided with the most critical moment of the landing. Hitler's sleep lasted long enough for history to take a different path. In conventional history books, the beaches of Normandy were the place where the war took its highest toll in a single day. But there was another place, 6 weeks earlier, where more American soldiers died. A place that Allied commanders kept secret for decades. A place less than 300 kilometers from the shores of Normandy in Devon, in the heart of the English ally, Slapton Sands. Exercise code Tiger. In the final weeks of April 1944, the Allies were carrying out final training exercises for the Normandy landing. The entire southern coast of Devon had been evacuated of its civil population to allow maneuvers with live ammunition. Exercise Tiger, scheduled for April 27th and 28th, consisted of simulating the assault on Utor Beach with the same troops that would participate in the real landing, the U.S. 4th Infantry Division, beach engineering units, and the fleet of LCTs and LSTs that would transport the DD amphibious tanks. In the early morning of April 28th, 8 German torpedo boats of the E-Boot series, which regularly patrolled the English Channel from the ports of Cherbourg, intercepted the training fleet by pure chance. What they found was not a combat formation. It was a convoy of slow landing ships loaded with soldiers who were practicing for war. but who at that moment were completely defenseless. The torpedoes struck 3 LST vessels. 2 of them sank. LST 507 caught fire and went to the bottom. LST 531 followed it in minutes. LST 289 survived, badly damaged. In the dark and freezing water of the channel, hundreds of men died from torpedoes, from fire, or simply from the weight of their own backpacks and equipment, which dragged them to the bottom when they fell into the sea. The final figures recorded in the military archives indicate that 749 American soldiers and sailors died in Exercise Tiger, more than on Utah Beach itself on June 6th. The first reaction of the Allied command was panic, but not because of the casualties. The panic was because among the dead officers in the channel there could be several with access to ultra-secret information about the actual D-Day, dates, places, codes. Faced with the risk that any of those bodies had fallen alive into German hands, the Allied command ordered search dredges for the bodies with feverish urgency. Only when all the bodies of the officers with classified access were located could Eisenhower breathe. The casualties of Exercise Tiger were classified as a military secret, and families received vague notifications. Some surviving soldiers were warned not to speak about what happened under pain of court-martial. The silence lasted decades. It was not until the 1980s when American historian Ken Small, living in Devon, began to rescue from the bottom of the sea armored vehicles sunk during the exercise, and to speak with survivors who still kept the secret. His investigation opened the first public breach in a story that the American military had kept buried. Why the secret? The official version was always that disclosure would have compromised the plans for the actual D-Day. But after the war, with the plans declassified and the victory won, the silence continued for decades more. Some historians have suggested that the motivation was simpler and darker. The Allied command did not want the public to know that more men had died in a failed training exercise than in the actual landing that exercise prepared. The 749 men of Exercise Tiger have a monument today on the shore of Slapton Sands. It would take 40 years for them to receive it. 13,000 bombs, none on the beach. In the 30 minutes prior to H hour at Omaha Beach, the heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force of the United States Army, B-24 Liberators and B-17 Flying Fortresses, unleashed upon the German positions of the Norman coast the largest concentration of aerial firepower ever launched in support of an amphibious assault. 13,000 bombs. The expectation of Bradley and Montgomery was that they would destroy the obstacles, the barbed wire, the firing positions, and a good portion of the German defenders. The reality was different. Not a single bomb fell on Omaha Beach. The technical explanation exists and is precise. The bombers flew from south to north, from the sea toward land, to reduce their exposure to German anti-aircraft artillery. Upon approaching the coast, the crews delayed the opening of the bomb bays by several seconds to avoid the risk of accidentally hitting the landing crafts that were advancing toward the shore. Those seconds of margin translated, at the speed and altitude of the aircraft, into a displacement of kilometers in the trajectory of the projectiles. The 13,000 bombs fell between 2 and 5 kilometers inland. They destroyed Norman farms, villages, fields. In Vierville-sur-Mer, the destruction of the first-line German formations was zero. But the question that historians have not been able to answer satisfactorily is broader. How was it possible that the plan for Omaha relied so critically on a bombing accuracy that all available data indicated was impossible to achieve? Captain Scott Bowden, a British sapper from the COPP who had reconnoitred the beach in December 1943, summarized it with brutal clarity when, from his landing craft, he saw the impacts of the bombs in the inland fields instead of on the German bunkers. For all the good that has done, they might as well have stayed home in bed. Bombing in the American doctrine of the era promised an accuracy that the aircraft of the time simply could not deliver. The 8th Air Force had been publishing bombing statistics for months, which the ground army accepted without the independent verification that the situation required. Montgomery, who could have insisted on the British doctrine of night landings that reduced dependence on air support, yielded on this point. The result was that thousands of American soldiers from the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions lowered the ramps of their crafts toward an intact beach, with the Germans in their positions completely fresh, waiting for them. But there is another component of the failure at Omaha that history books usually overlook and which Beevor details with precision. Military intelligence failed to correctly identify the German forces in the sector. The Allied plan assumed that the defenders of Omaha were principally men from the 716th Infantry Division, a formation of mediocre quality that included 3 battalions composed of former prisoners of the Red Army. What the Allies did not know with certainty was that the 352nd Infantry Division, a much more capable unit under the command of General Major Dietrich Krase, had been moved to the coast weeks before to reinforce the defenses. Brigadier Bill Williams, Montgomery's head of intelligence at the 21st Army Group, suspected the movement of the 352nd based on aerial photographs that showed a dense network of armored vehicle tracks in the coastal zone of Caen. The data reached the command, but was not sufficiently emphasized in the briefings prior to the landing. Planners assumed that the 352nd would remain in its usual position, half a day's march to the south, in the vicinity of Saint-Lô. However, even the danger of the 352nd had its factor of chance. On the night of June 5th to 6th, a significant part of its forces had been sent southward to investigate alleged activities of Allied paratroopers, a result of Operation Titanic, in which the Allies had dropped thousands of rubber dummies and 6 brave SAS soldiers to confuse the German defenders. If that reconnaissance battalion of Krase had not been sent on that phantom chase, the defense of Omaha would have been even more formidable than it was. The survivors of Omaha reconstructed for decades what had gone wrong. An officer of the 1st Division said it bluntly: "The Air Force could have stayed in bed and it wouldn't have changed anything for the worse, and it could have changed everything for the better." At 5:30 in the morning on June 6, 1944, 48 meters offshore from Omaha Beach, the officers of the landing craft tanks gave the order. The ramps lowered. The Sherman DD tanks began to roll into the water. The DD stood for duplex drive. The idea was a mechanical marvel. A conventional Sherman equipped with an extensible waterproof canvas around the hull which, when inflated with compressed air, created a float sufficient for the 32-ton tank to support itself on the surface. 2 propellers driven by the transmission propelled it in the water. Upon touching land, the canvas would collapse and the tank remained operational in seconds, ready to support the infantry with its fire from the first moment of the landing. In ideal conditions, it worked. The conditions of June 6, 1944 at Omaha were not ideal. The sea had waves of 1.5 meters to 2 meters. The commander of the tanks of Company B of the 741st Tank Battalion received the order to launch his vehicles 8,000 yards from the coast, the maximum envisioned in the original plan, with a justification of keeping them out of reach of German artillery. The canvases, soaked by the water of the channel, weighed twice as much as anticipated. The waves broke over the top edge of the floats. 27 of the 29 tanks sank, 27 out of 29. The metal and the men inside went down together to the bottom of the channel. Only 2 reached the shore because their LCTs carried them directly to the beach, given the manifest impossibility of their surviving in the water. Several crew members were able to get out through the hatch before sinking. Others died trapped. On the British beaches, the commanders of the DD battalions made different decisions. Those of the 1318 Hussars who supported Sword Beach received the order Floater 5000 to launch the tanks at 5,000 yards instead of 8,000. They lost 5 of their squadron, not 27 out of 29. Those of the Sherwood Rangers who supported Gold Beach were even more conservative and launched their tanks at 1,000 yards. They lost 8, but they arrived. At Omaha, the order was executed in its most literal terms and with the most lethal consequences. The question that persists is simple but without a satisfactory answer. Who made the final decision to launch the tanks at that distance? The prior orders were open to interpretation. The rigidity with which they were executed in that sector, with the sea in the state it was, suggests that some officer made the worst possible decision without questioning it. Military archives record the chain of command, but not the specific conversation. Testimonies of survivors contradict the official version in crucial details. What is documented is that the combat engineers, who were to land after the tanks to demolish the beach obstacles, lowered the ramps and found that the tanks that were supposed to cover their work no longer existed. Many of them died in the first minutes, acting as infantry since they had no other option. The plan for Omaha was an interdependent system. Each part depended on the previous one working. When the tank sank, the system collapsed. At 4 o'clock in the morning on June 6, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel James E. Rudder, commanding the 2nd U.S. Army Ranger Battalion, looked out from his landing craft at the cliffs of Point du Hoc. What he had before him was a 30-meter-high limestone rock cut vertically over the Atlantic, battered by the waves, defended from above by a German garrison. The mission was to climb them. Allied intelligence had identified at Point du Hoc a German artillery battery of 6 155mm guns capable of reaching both Utah and Omaha beaches and destroying landing ships within a radius of dozens of kilometers. They were, in the language of Allied planners, a critical position that must be neutralized before H hour. If the guns at Point du Hoc remained operational when the landing began, they could make the American assault unviable. The Rangers scaled the cliffs under enemy fire. They used grapnels fired by rockets, which the astonished German garrison described in their communications as rockets fired from ships that throw rope ladders. The first men reached the top with casualties. The next reinforced them. At 700 hours, the captain of the battery had been neutralized and the Rangers were making their way through the emplacements. The guns were not there. The emplacements were prepared, the concrete mounts intact, the bunkers in perfect condition. But there were no 155mm guns, only wooden poles installed in the embrasures to simulate weaponry from the air. The real weapons were in a field, about 500 meters south of the cliffs, camouflaged under branches with abundant ammunition piled beside them, completely intact and apparently ready to be used. The historical explanation indicates that the Germans had moved the guns from the original emplacements shortly before the landing, probably as a result of the intense Allied bombardments on the position, which had destroyed the access ways. But the guns had not been dismantled or destroyed. They were simply located 500 meters from where the Allies had designed the entire assault operation. A small group of Rangers, in their exploration beyond the cliffs, found the guns almost by accident. They were still operational, still threatening. They destroyed them with demolition charges. What no one has explained satisfactorily is how the Allied intelligence system, which in many respects worked with extraordinary precision during the preparation for D-Day, arrived at the beach with the exact position of the most important artillery battery in the American sector, without knowing that the guns were no longer where they were supposed to be. Aerial photographs from the preceding days clearly showed the wooden poles in the emplacements, but analysts interpreted them as real guns covered with camouflage netting. The Rangers scaled 30 meters of vertical rock, lost men doing so, and found wooden poles. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder also had a second piece of bad luck. Upon approaching the cliffs, his convoy was initially carried several kilometers to the east by the Royal Navy coxswain, piloting the flotilla almost directly toward Omaha beaches. The course correction cost half an hour. When the Rangers finally arrived at the base of the cliffs and began to climb, the 5th Ranger Battalion, which was waiting offshore with orders to follow them if it received the success signal before 700 hours, had received no message. It assumed the assault had failed and veered toward Omaha. The radio of Rudder's operator was not working. Seawater had short-circuited the equipment. The signal, "Praise the Lord," was never transmitted. The 5th Battalion landed at Omaha. Rudder and his men, without reinforcements, without the possibility of transmitting their position, held out for 2 full days at Point du Hoc, surrounded by German counterattacks, using ammunition stolen from the enemies they had killed, until reliefs arrived. There is something deeply strange about the way Adolf Hitler received the news of the largest amphibious landing in history. According to the converging testimonies of several eyewitnesses, collected in memoirs and post-war statements, the initial reaction of Hitler when he finally learned that the Allies had landed in Normandy was joy. Oberstleutnant Nikolaus von Below, Hitler's Luftwaffe adjutant who was with him at the Berghof that day, recorded that the Führer reacted with rejoicement to the news, convinced that the enemy was going to be crushed on the beaches. Other witnesses added that Hitler had waited for that moment for months, that he was certain that the Luftwaffe and the armor would destroy the landing and that this would open the possibility of transferring divisions from the Western Front to the Eastern Front for a decisive offensive against Stalin. "I have said all along that it would come here. he was attributed to have said, although with his prediction oscillating between Normandy and the Pas-de-Calais in the preceding weeks. General Alfred Jodl, chief of the OKW operations staff, had decided not to wake Hitler that morning. The decision to let the Führer sleep while his subordinates desperately tried to mobilize responses was the result of a poisonous command culture in which no one wanted to be the bearer of bad news. No one wanted to assume responsibilities that belonged to the Führer, and no one had the formal authority to act without his approval. The practical result was that the most powerful force available for the counterattack, the ISS Panzer Corps with its divisions quartered in the Paris region, remained motionless during the most critical hours of the landing. When Hitler awoke and was informed, his reaction of rejoicement did not translate into urgent and intelligent orders. The orders he issued remained chaotic and contradictory, driven by the certainty that Normandy was secondary and by the impossible instruction to clear the beachhead before dusk. The Chief of Staff of the German 7th Army responded that this was impossible. He was right. If Rommel is the great mystery of the strategic level of June 6, 1944, the 21st Panzer Division is the great mystery of the tactical level. The 21st Panzer was the only German armoured division situated within immediate reach of the D-Day beaches. It had its units dispersed around Caen with 127 Mark IV tanks and 40 assault guns. In theory, it was exactly the type of force that Rommel wanted in an advanced position to launch an immediate counterattack as soon as any landing began. At 1:20 in the morning on June 6th, General Lieutenant Wilhelm Richter, commander of the 716th Infantry Division, tried to order a part of the 21st Panzer to attack the Allied paratroopers landing east of the Orne. The attempt was unsuccessful because General Feutinger was not at his command post. According to Max Hastings, whose investigation gathers direct testimonies from the officers of the division, the widespread belief among the men of the 21st Panzer was that Feutinger was out of contact with a female friend in Paris that night. The exact whereabouts were never officially confirmed, but Captain Eberhard Wegmann, who was serving as watch officer at the division headquarters in the absence of the commander and the senior staff officer, also absent, testified that he could only take minimal emergency measures without the presence of the general. The practical consequences of that double absence were measurable in hours. Without clear orders, the armour of the 21st did not move until 6:30 hours, at which moment the first Allied soldiers had already been on Sword Beach for more than 2 hours. The first organised reaction of the division occurred at 800 hours, when Oberst Hermann von Oppeln-Bronikowski, commander of the tank regiment, finally received instructions, but even then confusion multiplied delays. The 21st Panzer was ordered first to attack the paratroopers east of the Orne, then it was stopped, turned around, sent west through the city of Caen, which exposed its vehicles for hours to Allied air attacks. The detour through Caen reduced the 104 Mark IV tanks available at the start of the day to no more than 60 operational by the time the formation reached the Perrier Ridge that afternoon. General Erich Marx, commander of the 84th Corps, went personally to the starting point of the 21st Panzer to witness the attack. He was a man who knew the situation with clinical clarity. He told the tank regiment commander von Oppeln-Bronikowski, "Oppeln, if you don't succeed in throwing the British back into the sea, we have lost the war." Von Oppeln saluted and climbed into his vehicle. What followed was, in the words of Hastings, a gesture, no more. The tanks advanced northward and reached the gap between the British perimeter of the 3rd Division and the Canadians, the only unguarded point of the entire Allied beachhead at that moment. If they had reached the shore and established themselves there, they would have cut the landing line in two. But instead, they found the anti-tank artillery of the Staffordshire Yeomanry waiting for them with their Sherman Fireflies, armed with the 17-pounder gun that matched the fearsome German 88mm in range. 13 Mark IV tanks were destroyed in minutes. And then something occurred that no one on the German staff had foreseen. At 20:30 hours, the sky over Normandy filled with nearly 250 gliders of the British 6th Airborne Division, transporting a reinforcement brigade to the positions east of the Orne. The sight of that sky full of gliders arriving from the northwest caused the tanks of the 21st Panzer that had reached Lyon-sur-Mer to conclude that they were being surrounded. They withdrew toward Caen. The temporal coincidence was, in the words of Beevor, fortunate for the British. The gliders were not going to surround anyone, They were landing in an area already controlled. But the visual threat was enough to determine the outcome of the only real opportunity for a German armored counterattack on D-Day. The Battle of June 6th at the tactical level was decided in part by the absence of a commander, by hours of confusion and contradictory orders, and by the psychology of tank crews who interpreted as an encirclement what was a reinforcement operation. The 5 sectors of the landing of June 6, 1944 were assigned with a precise cartographic logic: Utah and Omaha for the Americans, Gold, Juno and Sword for the British and Canadians. But between some of those sectors there were coastal zones with no assigned objective, and one of them was on the verge of becoming the breaking point of the entire operation. The breach between Sword Beach and Juno Beach was not a map curiosity. It was a corridor of several miles of Norman coast where, at noon on June 6th, there was no consolidated Allied infantry. The British 3rd Division had its units fighting inland from Sword, and the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division was doing the same from Juno, but the space between both remained open during crucial hours. To understand why that breach was not exploited, one must understand first why it existed. The Allied landing plan assumed that the assault divisions would advance rapidly inland and that their flanks would unite as they progressed. What the planners had not calibrated with sufficient rigor was the speed with which the beaches themselves would become congested. At Sword, abnormally strong coastal winds had produced an extraordinarily high tide. Instead of the usual 9 meters of beach between the high tide mark and the retaining wall, that morning there were less than 3 meters of dry sand where the armor, the trucks, the engineering vehicles and the waves of infantry that kept arriving had to maneuver. The Staffordshire Yeomanry, whose Sherman Fireflies were the only ones capable of facing the German panzers with any possibility of success, became stuck in that traffic jam for more than an hour before being able to even reach the coastal road. After that, its advance was slow and intermittent, stuck to the narrow roads that uncleared minefields flanked on both sides. It was that chain of delays, and not a deliberate tactical decision, that left the breach open when the tanks of von Oppeln-Bronichowski's 21st Panzer arrived that afternoon with 80 Mark IVs under his command. They advanced northward through the space between the perimeters. They crossed the fields without encountering organized resistance. When they arrived at the coast in Lyon-sur-Mer, the few Germans who remained in the bunkers of the 716th Division received them with signs of relief. The corridor was open, and then the tanks stopped. The question that no subsequent analysis has resolved completely satisfactorily is why. The tanks that arrived at Lyon-sur-Mer did not turn east to attack the open flank of the Sword forces, nor west to penetrate the rear of the Canadians at Juno. According to the testimonies gathered by Hastings from the men of the 21st Panzer themselves, among them Corporal Werner Kortenhaus, the regiment had suffered more severe losses than expected during the attack. Its communications with the higher command were practically non-existent, and the chain of counter-orders and changes of direction accumulated since dawn had left the officers exhausted and without a clear image of what they had before them. They had reached the shore, yes, but they did not know with precision what was to their right or to their left. They had no contact with Feuchtinger at headquarters, and the Allied destroyers anchored off the coast began to fire at any concentration of vehicles visible from the sea. Allied naval fire was one of the great equalizers of D-Day that conventional accounts tend to underestimate. The guns of the destroyers and cruisers could reach positions several miles inland with a precision that made any concentration of armor in an open space immediately vulnerable. The tanks of von Oppeln-Bronichowski, stopped on a coastal strip visible from the sea, were exactly the type of target for which the Allied ships had been waiting for orders all day. There is something else, and it is the part of the account that Hastings reconstructs with greater drama. When the sky filled with nearly 250 gliders of the British 6th Airborne Division at 20:30 hours, transporting reinforcements toward the zones east of the Orne, the men of the 21st Panzer in Lyon-sur-Mer interpreted what they saw as the beginning of an engulfment movement. The gliders came from the northwest. From the perspective of a German tanker on the shore, it appeared that the Allies were landing troops at their back to cut off their retreat. It was an incorrect interpretation, but it was understandable given the level of confusion and exhaustion that the division dragged from the early hours of dawn. The German tactical regulation in that situation was clear. If a risk of encirclement exists, orderly retreat. They retreated. But the Allied side that afternoon was not free from its own mysteries. The Canadian advance from Juno was, in some sectors, spectacularly faster than anticipated. The 3rd Canadian Division, fighting under intense fire on the beaches of Courseulles-sur-Mer and Bernières-sur-Mer during the morning, had managed to penetrate several kilometers inland by the afternoon. Toward dusk, 2 troops of the 1st Hussars, without waiting for instructions and leaving their own infantry far behind, had advanced along the Bayeux-Caen road until reaching Bretteville-l'Orgueilleuse, almost at the outer limit of the D-Day objectives. They were less than 5 kilometers from the Carpiquet airfield, on the outskirts of Caen, the objective that Montgomery had marked as the centerpiece of the British and Canadian advance. The loneliness of their position without supporting infantry, without communication with the rest of the brigade, in unknown terrain and with night falling, made them turn and fall back. If those tanks had continued, they almost certainly would have encountered the vanguard elements of the 12th SS Panzer Hitler Jugend arriving from Lisieux. The 12th SS was different from the 21st Panzer. Its men were fanatics trained, many of them 17 and 18 years old, more willing to die than to cede terrain. In the following days, they demonstrated what they were capable of. The Hussars would have been destroyed almost certainly. And yet, Caen did not fall that day. It did not fall in weeks. The city that Montgomery had promised to take on D-Day resisted until July, amid bombardments that destroyed it almost completely. It is difficult not to look back at those 2 troops of tanks on the road of June 6th and wonder if the history of the Normandy campaign would have had a different shape if they had followed 1 kilometer more. A few hours before the takeoff of the transport planes that would carry the men of the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions over the Cotentin, Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory, Allied Air Commander-in-Chief, summoned Eisenhower to communicate his conviction that the operation would be a slaughter. Leigh-Mallory had analyzed the German defenses on the Cotentin Peninsula and reached the conclusion that the paratroopers were going to be decimated in the air and upon landing. His calculations projected losses in the transport planes that would make any tactical utilization of the operation unviable. He formally requested its cancellation. Eisenhower rejected the request with the support of Montgomery, but he asked Leigh-Mallory to put his objection in writing. The document exists. There is something peculiar about Leigh-Mallory's history within the D-Day narrative. He was a man who made enemies with ease, who irritated practically everyone who worked with him, and who was unequivocally defeatist in his prediction about the airborne divisions, and he was wrong. The airborne operation of June 6th suffered significant losses, but well below Leigh-Mallory's nightmare scenarios. Of the 850 transport planes that carried the American paratroopers, 21 were destroyed. Of the 400 planes that transported the British gliders and airborne troops, 8 did not return. Eisenhower, who had secretly prepared a communiqué assuming responsibility in case of failure of the entire operation, received the call from Leigh-Mallory at dawn. The Air Marshal had already drafted his note of acknowledgement. "I am more grateful than I can express that my fears were without foundation." But the complete picture is less clean than that headline of relief. The paratroopers of both American divisions scattered in an area enormously larger than envisioned. The 82nd Airborne, which was to concentrate around Sainte-Mère-Église to cut the Cotentin Peninsula, found its men scattered for dozens of kilometers around, many dead upon landing, many captured, many drowned in the flooded meadows that the Germans had created by opening the river sluice gates. The 101st Airborne, tasked with securing the exits from Utah Beach, operated that night in a tactical confusion that any prior planner would have qualified as disastrous. And yet it worked. It worked because the dispersion of thousands of armed men throughout the entire German rear zone in the Cotentin created a confusion that paralyzed enemy reinforcements. The Germans could not know where there were paratroopers because there were paratroopers everywhere. Brigadier General James M. Gavin of the 82nd Airborne, who during the night found himself alone with a small group of men without a radio and without a precise map, simply began to move toward the sound of the guns. The same was done by hundreds of small groups throughout the entire night. Was the airborne operation a success or a controlled failure? Historians continue without agreeing. Leigh-Mallory, perhaps aware of having been wrong in the fundamental, although not in the details, preferred to keep silence about the matter after the war. Among the personal papers of General Dwight D. Eisenhower guarded in the National Archives of the United States, there is a document written by hand that none of his aides saw when it was drafted. Eisenhower wrote it on the afternoon of June 5, 1944, hours before the first paratroopers jumped over Normandy, and kept it in the pocket of his uniform. It was the communiqué he would publish if the operation failed. Our landings in the Cherbourg-Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air and the navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. Eisenhower put it in his pocket and did not mention it to anyone. His aide, Captain Harry Butcher, who kept the Supreme Commander's personal diary throughout the entire war, did not know of the document's existence until much later. It was found accidentally in a folder of personal papers after the war. The existence of the document reveals something about the real nature of the certainty with which the Allies faced D-Day that contrasts with the retrospective image of confidence that has been constructed in the subsequent decades. Eisenhower and all those who planned Overlord knew that it could fail. Failure was not a remote possibility. It was sufficiently probable for the Supreme Commander to personally draft the accountability communique. Bradley knew that Omaha could be a disaster. Lee Mallory knew it about the paratroopers. Eisenhower himself knew that the meteorological window in which everything was staked was narrow and fragile. None of them said it out loud, because saying it out loud would have destroyed the morale of 175,000 men who were about to get onto ships. The folded paper in Eisenhower's pocket during all of D-Day is, in its own way, the most honest document of the entire operation. In it is written what the Supreme Commander really thought about his probabilities that June morning. The paper was never necessary. Eisenhower threw it in the trash a few days later without anyone seeing it, and only remembered it when someone found the draft almost by accident. The general was the only one who knew he had written it. He did not mention it in his memoirs. The story of Dr. James Stagg as meteorologist of the Supreme Headquarters is usually told as a story of success. The Scottish scientist who convinced Eisenhower to take advantage of a window of good weather in the middle of a storm and thus saved the operation. But the real story is more complex and less orderly. In the days prior to June 5th, the Allied meteorological team was deeply divided. The experts from the Royal Navy, those from the Air Force, and the American civil meteorologists received the same weather data from the stations but arrived at significantly different predictions. Stagg, who had to present a unified forecast to the command, admitted to Major General Harold Bull, Eisenhower's deputy chief of staff, that the situation is complex and difficult. Bull responded to him that if he did not have it clear before the conference of the following day, the Supreme Commander would find out. The storm of June 4th and 5th was real and violent. June 5th, the date originally planned for the landing, would have produced conditions that would have made the amphibious landing impossible or catastrophic. The 24-hour postponement that Eisenhower ordered was correct. But what Stagg predicted for June 6th was not good weather. It was acceptable weather. Partially covered skies, moderate wind, waves of 1 to 1.5 meters. Sufficient for the landing, sufficient for aerial bombardments, perhaps in normal conditions, not sufficient for the precision bombers of the 8th Air Force that needed perfect visibility to aim their loads. And here is one of the rifts that historians point out without having reached a satisfactory answer. If it was known that the meteorological conditions of June 6th would not be optimal for the precision bombing that the Omaha plan required, why was the air support plan not modified? Why did the liberators and fortresses of Colonel James Doolittle continue to have as their mission the neutralization of coastal positions that the planners of the command already knew they could hardly hit with the necessary precision? The partial answer is in the inertia of plans. When an operation of that scale has been designed, approved, and memorized by thousands of officers, modifying one of its critical components 24 hours from the start requires a chain of decisions and communications that the system simply cannot process with that speed. The Omaha plan remained the Omaha plan because it was the only plan that existed. The Germans, for their part, knew nothing of all this. Their own meteorologists, who lacked the data from the North Atlantic stations that the Allies did have, had predicted that the weather would not be suitable for a landing before June 10th. That false prediction was what convinced Rommel that he could leave to celebrate his wife's birthday. It was what led Generaloberst Dollmann to call his command exercise in Rennes on June 6th. It was what kept Feuchtinger out of his post that night. The meteorological breach between what the Allies knew and what the Germans believed was ultimately one of the determining factors of D-Day. Stagg and his team of meteorologists, with their Atlantic stations and their discordant predictions, knew something that the Germans could not know. That knowledge was worth more than any other tactical advantage. While discussions between Hitler and the OKW paralyzed the deployment of the Panzer Reserves, the officer who should have coordinated the German armored counterattack had been tied for hours by a command structure so dysfunctional that 6 different headquarters stood between him and the power to give an executive order. General der Panzertruppen Leo Freiherr Geyer von Schweppenberg was, on paper, the right man for that role. He had been a military attaché in London before the war and knew Allied strategic thinking with a depth that few German officers could match. He shared with Guderian the classic doctrine of the massive and concentrated use of armor. To gather the panzer divisions in the rear, out of reach of naval artillery, wait until the direction of the main attack was unequivocally clear, and strike with all available mass in a single decisive counterattack. It was the same logic that had worked in Poland, in France in the opening stages of Barbarossa. The problem was that in June 1944 that logic depended on having real authority over the divisions, and Geyer did not have it. The doctrinal dispute between Geyer and Rommel, who operated at a completely different level in the command structure, was well known in Allied headquarters thanks to ultra-decryptions. Rommel wanted the panzers forward, on or near the coast, ready to counterattack in the first minutes of the landing before Allied air superiority could act. Geyer wanted them in the rear, concentrated and protected. Hitler, faithful to his tendency to resolve the disagreements of his subordinates by imposing himself without resolving anything, made the decision most comfortable for his ego and most damaging to his armies. He divided the panzer divisions between both concepts, but retained under his personal control the most powerful ones so he could decide for himself at the critical moment. The result on the morning of June 6th was a snapshot of institutional paralysis. The 12th SS Panzer Hitlerjugend, considered by many German officers the most formidable armoured formation on the Western Front, was quartered in the forests south of Caen. The Panzer Lehr, equipped with the most modern material available, including Panthers in its tank battalions and armoured half-tracks for all its motorised infantry, waited further south. The 1st SS Panzer Corps, the Great Strategic Reserve, remained in the Paris region. None of these formations could move without explicit authorization from Hitler. When Blumentritt from the OB West headquarters in Saint-Germain-en-Laye asked for that authorization at 6 o'clock hours on June 6th, the response was no. The Führer was asleep and no one was going to wake him. The hours accumulated with an almost grotesque mechanics. At 700 hours, the OKW returned the call to communicate that it objected violently to the arbitrary deployment of the OKW reserves. The units that Rundstedt had tried to move on his own had to stop immediately. General Jodl called Speidel personally in La Roche-Guyon to ensure that the order was complied with. Rundstedt, who in private referred to Hitler as that Bohemian corporal, had no other resources faced with this situation than bitterness. Geyer, meanwhile, tried to plan the counterattack he believed necessary with the means that were under his operational command. The 21st Panzer was technically the only armoured unit that could act without needing authorization from the OKW, although even its movements on that day were conditioned by contradictory orders from multiple intermediate headquarters. General Marx of the 84th Corps needed it to attack the bridges over the Orne. Geyer wanted to concentrate it for the western counterattack. Feuchtinger, had he been present, could have at least imposed a single direction. In his absence, von Oppeln-Bronickowski's tank regiment received different orders within a few hours and spent a good part of the day making the long detour through Caen, exposed to the Allied fighter bombers patrolling the area. The result was that the Panzer Lehr, the only division capable of matching in power any Allied armoured formation, did not arrive at the front until June 8th and did so decimated. Its commander, General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, who knew from North Africa the consequences of moving armored columns by day under enemy air superiority, had begged Dollmann to be allowed to make the march by night or at dawn. The order was to maintain the daytime movement to arrive as soon as possible. The RAF Typhoon fighter bombers and American P-47 Thunderbolts found the column on the open roads of Normandy. Bayerlein reported later that upon arriving at the front, the division had already lost 5 destroyed tanks, 84 half-track vehicles, and more than 130 trucks and vehicles of all types. It had departed as a shock force and arrived as a garrison force. The 12th SS Hitlerjugend fared better in the movement because it departed at night from Lisieux and arrived at the position south of Caen relatively intact on June 6th itself. But it arrived late for the first day's counterattack. When Rommel returned to his headquarters at dusk and asked why the Panzerlehr and the 12th SS were held back, Speidel explained to him the OKW's refusal to make any decision. Rommel responded with a single word: madness. Then he added that of course they would arrive late, but that they had to be put in motion immediately. Guyer's situation had an abrupt professional end, technically caused by the Allies themselves. On June 10th, ultra-decryptions revealed the exact location of the Panzer Group West headquarters installed in the park of the Château de la Caen near Thury Harcourt. Allied medium bombers attacked the position. The headquarters was destroyed with a precision that was almost surgical. The main building was left in ruins. Almost all the first echelon staff officers died in the attack, and the signals battalion was practically annihilated. Geyer survived wounded. Panzer Group West was left without command capacity for days at the moment when it was most needed. Geyer was relieved on July 2nd after presenting Hitler with a written report that left no room for ambiguities about the real situation of the front. He asserted that the strategy of keeping the panzers stuck to the defensive line under constant fire from naval artillery and Allied aviation was equivalent to destroying them gradually without being able to use them. He requested a withdrawal behind the Orne River and the concentration of means for a proper counterattack. Hitler dismissed him that same day. His report was branded defeatist. What Geyer von Schweppenberg left written about those days has the stark precision of someone who knows he is right and knows that it no longer matters. At the moment when everything depended on speed, our command was paralyzed successively by the following headquarters: ISS Panzer Corps, Panzer Group West, 7th Army in Le Mans, Army Group B, OB West and OKW. 6 filters between need and decision. 6 places where urgency could stop, dilute, be reinterpreted, or simply get lost. In the months that followed June 6, 1944, when the July 20th plot against Hitler was discovered and its participants began to be arrested and executed, the SS and the Gestapo began to review the events of D-Day with a different eye. The question that emerged in the reports of the Nazi security services was direct. Had the army officers involved in the conspiracy deliberately sabotaged the German response to the Allied landing? The name that appeared most frequently was that of General Lieutenant Hans Speidel himself, Rommel's chief of staff in Army Group B. He was a known member of the circle of anti-Hitler conspirators. He was the officer who that night had invited other conspirators to dine at La Roche-Guyon while the headquarters awaited news from the front. He was, in the words of Beaver, the man who recorded that Rommel bitterly cited Hitler's own dictum in Mein Kampf about the futility of static defense. Speidel survived the war, the denazification process, and the conspiracy trial itself. He was rehabilitated and went on to become one of the founding generals of the Bundeswehr and the military structure of NATO in the 1950s. He never confessed to any act of sabotage on June 6th, but the structure of suspicion persists. At the precise moment when the Army Group B headquarters should have been coordinating an energetic response to the largest landing in history, its chief of staff was dining with his conspirator friends. The decisions of that night were, in the best case, slow and uncoordinated. In the worst case, the documented evidence is insufficient to reach a firm conclusion. Historians, beginning with Beaver and Hastings, are cautious in this regard. The slowness of the Germans that night can be completely explained by real confusion, the paralyzing command structure, and the success of the Allied deception. No treason is needed to explain what occurred, but neither can it be completely ruled out. 80 years after D-Day, it is not known with certainty how many men died on June 6, 1944. The official numbers, revised and re-estimated on multiple occasions, hover in the most serious studies around 10,000 to 12,000 Allied casualties among dead, wounded, and missing. In Omaha alone, calculations oscillate between 2,000 and 4,700 casualties, depending on the source and methodology. The disparity in those figures is not rhetorical. It reflects a real imprecision in military records, in the distinction between killed in action and drowned, between confirmed missing and simply never found. The 749 men of Exercise Tiger do not appear in the D-Day counts. For decades, part of those deaths were counted as casualties of the real landing to avoid uncomfortable explanations. Some historians estimate that the figures could be underestimated by several hundred men, a result of incomplete records, the practice of burying the dead in undocumented sites, and the administrative confusions inherent to an operation of 175,000 people in simultaneous movement. German casualties are even more uncertain. Estimates range from 4,000 to more than 9,000 among dead, wounded, and captured. The Wehrmacht archives in that period are incomplete, partly because many units were destroyed or scattered before being able to present complete reports, and the Norman civilians. The bombardments prior to D-Day, intended to cut German communications and movements, killed a number of French civilians that Eisenhower, according to Beaver, had placed at 10,000 as an acceptable limit before requesting a revision of the plan. The most recent calculations speak of more than 15,000 French civilians dead and 19,000 wounded during the entire Normandy campaign of 1944, a number of victims over which popular histories of D-Day usually pass quickly. Behind every number is a man or a woman. The exact name of how many of them died on June 6, 1944, is still not fixed with certainty in any definitive record. D-Day was, in many ways, an operation that should have gone wrong and did not go wrong, or that went well in some places in ways that no one had planned, and badly in other places for reasons that no one had foreseen. A fleet of 5,000 ships crossed the English Channel without being detected thanks to a Catalan poultry salesman and his non-existent agents. The greatest German defensive commander was absent because his meteorologists did not know how to read the Atlantic. The Führer was asleep. The best German armor did not arrive on time because it needed his approval. The bombers dropped 13,000 bombs that did not fall where they should. The amphibious tanks sank. The guns of the most important battery in the American sector were not where intelligence said they were. And yet the soldiers reached the shore, scaled the cliffs, crossed the beach, and at the end of the day, the beachheads were real and solid. The story that has not finished being told about D-Day is not the story of the heroes, which is real and deserved. It is the story of all the things that were on the verge of turning out another way, of the decisions that no one made when they should have, of the men who died because someone launched some tanks too far from the shore, of the 749 who died in the exercise and whose families waited decades to know the truth. 80 years later, some archives remain the subject of study, some testimonies contradict each other, some questions have no verifiable answer. But the dead of June 6, 1944, all of them, deserve that the questions continue to be asked.